Feedback and assessment. Is it useful? Well, Bill Gates thinks so, and if Bill thinks it, I think we can all learn something. So how do we assess our students? Well, a lot of the time, we grade them or give them a number. Now, what do these numbers mean? How can you tell your achievement by a number? Why do we give a final test? Why are these numbers so important? Who are we even working for? Well, there's two sorts of feedback we can give. Quantitative feedback, which is anything which can be expressed as a number or graded, and qualitative feedback, which is anything which cannot be graded. Which is most useful to us as teachers? Well, qualitative feedback, it helps us refine our lessons, skills, and our materials, and it gives us data about issues with the whole class and individuals. The motivation of students to work towards a score. Why not move that motivation towards interest in the subject and joy of learning? Qualitative feedback improves confidence and autonomy in students, which is always a good thing, and always moving that motivation from the means to achieve a prize, a score, the carrot and the stick, towards an inner curiosity to learn, which I believe is innate in all teenagers and young people. And it gives students study skills, learning skills, not just abstract knowledge. Students start to think about how they're thinking and learn about how they're learning. They start to become involved in the process. So how do we get students to listen to our feedback? Well, don't always focus on the negative. Try lots of positive reinforcement. Find plenty of good examples of English. Don't dwell on their mistakes as a class. Our classes want to move forward, so focusing on their errors will demotivate them. Our students are, after all, on holiday, and they've come here to communicate. The only numbers or grades a SUL student should receive are from the placement test at the beginning of the course and on the final test. If you supply a list of helpful constructive comments and you include a grade or score, the only thing the student will focus on is the score. If you leave out the score, they might just read your comments. Have a look at this sentence written by Professor Dylan Williams from University College of London. Pause the video and consider, what does Professor Williams mean by this? Well, perhaps this is what he means. Give the student specific feedback. There's no need to correct absolutely everything. Instead, focus on a small number of errors which reflect the student's biggest area of weakness. For example, it might be writing words which are spelled differently to the pronunciation. It might be expressing the past tense or a particular pronunciation error. Make sure that the largest part of the work is done by the student. They should be doing the thinking, not you. You can give the student examples of some of the errors they're making, and then they can continue to find similar errors themselves. Instead of correcting absolutely everything for them, give them examples of the mistakes which are typical, and then they can correct in pairs or self-correct. And students must devote their brain to the activity. Please don't do the thinking for them. Marking work in red pen or giving a score is of no help at all. It does the work for the students, and we need to teach them thinking skills. I would encourage all teachers to read The Breakdown of Skills in Bloom's Taxonomy. Now, if the students are asking these questions, which of the thinking skills are they using? Pause the video, have a look at the grey triangle. which skills are students using if they're asking these questions for themselves? Sometimes the best way to correct a student is not by correcting her at all. At least not directly. Everybody has a natural feedback mechanism in their brain. We hear our own speech and that of others. And our brain makes corrections based on what we hear without us even realising it's happening. This is a slide from my child-centred learning video. Instead of pointing out mistakes that your student has made, try repeating back what she said using the correct language structure and pronunciation. Odds are that she'll realise her own mistake and say it correctly next time. Sometimes the best way to correct student errors is just to wait, pause, or don't respond, and your student will often realise her own mistake and will repeat what she said using the correct structure. Though this method doesn't give students direct feedback, it does encourage them to listen to themselves and speak and find their own errors. Again, metacognition. They're thinking about how they're thinking and learning about how they're learning. And it's a much more natural process of language learning anyway. Now, I'm going to show you some of my techniques one by one to give feedback. That's your keyword for this video, by the way, compass. An error correction key. Now, giving a code for each error rather than correcting the student and telling them precisely what the error is. In written tasks, you can supply this in the margin or right next to the error it is, depending on how hard you want to make it. Rather than correcting each mistake with red pen, give the students an error code and they can find and correct the error for themselves. Now, you don't have to correct every single error, just perhaps one per line. This is something I've tried, a self-report. Throughout the course, give the students feedback on each task, written feedback, and they take this feedback and they write their own report, including an action plan on how they're going to achieve better learning strategies in the future. You can use a marking scheme, but make it a qualitative marking scheme, which has no score. This will give them useful feedback. You can make notes on the scheme, detailing how the student fits into each band. With the class, you can brainstorm or mind map typical mistakes that students make within their class. Now, they know which errors they make, and you can train them to notice these mistakes over several days. Tell them to proofread and edit, self-correction all the time. And then again, they will start thinking about how they're thinking and learning about how they're learning. As students are speaking, write down a selection of errors and a selection of excellent examples of English on the whiteboard or in a notebook, anonymously, of course. Ask the class to correct the errors in groups. The teachers can guide the students towards the right correction, and they must find the answers together. You can also use error correction codes to give the students a hint about what sort of errors they're looking for. Now, if the students have done some written work, you can take a variety of mistakes from their written work and type them out. Give them to groups to correct together, but don't give them any help at all. Notice that I've given the number of mistakes in each sentence here. This can be turned into a betting game. Redrafting is always good. Give students specific and general feedback. Make sure that the feedback gives them something to think about. For instance, this student up here wrote a tautology. I've said, Google it. I've asked the student to think about whether speaking in the past tense is correct. Again, to encourage the student to think about how she's thinking and learn about how she's learning. Here's a good idea I've seen. Give the students this template. They can have a list of spoken or written errors, and they must decide whether the sentences are right or wrong, and choose how sure they are. Now look at the first sentence. The student thought that this sentence is correct, but he was only 30% sure. And he guessed wrong, so he loses 30 points. Now, an advantage of giving written feedback is that it's going to give you an easy record of things to write on the student's end of course reports. Now, you can let the criteria on the report guide you: speaking, listening, pronunciation, vocabulary, reading, student achievement, areas for improvement. If you've kept a record of qualitative feedback and constructive comments, this will make writing the report at the end of the course a lot easier. And of course, the paperwork that you hand to the student and ultimately their parents will be more authentic. You can also base this on their self-report, because a student can hardly argue if you're writing in their report what they believe their weaknesses and strengths are. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I hope this has helped.